All right, now we talked about so we talked about kind of like the different types of influence. Now we want to talk about two other really important parts. This is the majority and the minority influence, right? We want to talk about when does the majority actually win? When is it more likely in a Nash type paradigm, for instance, that the minority, the one person who knows what is right and what is wrong, does not conform, and when it is more likely that the person conforms. And then the other one, which is I think is really interesting, at the end we talk shortly about this, is like, how can a minority, how can a small group of descendants actually make their way into the majority? How can they influence the majority in a way that then the majority starts seeing the way the minority sees the world? So we talk about majority and minority influence. So let's say this is the majority here. Everybody is the same. And what we kind of see here is like, what happens if somebody either displays or knows in Ash, like that the reality is slightly different here, indicated by a pink circle. So normally what we see is, right, that basically the pink circle disappears again. The majority, that's majority influence, right? There's a dissent, and the majority basically, by making, most often all that is needed is basically just making them feel uncomfortable. They realize, oh my God, I'm descending. Now this influence disappears. So this dissent disappears, the majority exerted the influence. So when is this more likely that the majority makes the minority change their mind, or at least publicly changes their mind? One factor that is kind of obvious that I just want to quickly mention is basically the size. If you double the size of the majority, it's much more likely that people conform. So it's easier to dissent if you only disagree with 3 people than to dissent with 300 people. So this is group size has a real impact on majority versus minority influence. There's another one which we saw in the Ash paradigm. It's easier to get basically a majority to conform, or like the minority to conform with the majority, if the perception of the issue at hand is somewhat ambiguous, right? So let's say you're kind of like an ambiguous situation. You don't know whether it like, let's say in Ash's example, the lines are really, really close together, right? Now you're thinking, I don't know, I might be wrong, I might be not. Now it's much easier. You're much more susceptible to be influenced by the majority, as if you can clearly see that the line is longer. So ambiguity and group size are kind of like the classic starting points for majority influence. A third one is, I forgot to animate this, but let's say you're in the following situation. You either stand here on the left side, where you can see it's a really nice and neat environment, and you kind of know, it seems like in this area of the town, people don't litter. And let's say here you're on the right, where it's obviously that people are kind of cool and fine with somewhat of littering, right? So you can perceive the norms that exist within these different types of areas, have like immediately just perceiving the environment. You don't even have to see other people, right? The social influence is apparent in our environment. And you can see here, this is basically how often people litter. And what you can see is that if there is kind of like a littered environment, so it's fine to litter, people in general litter more, right? And here in an anti-littering norm, in a clean environment, people litter less. So here you're less likely to litter than here. But the interesting thing here is that a Cialdini, and we come a lot in the 3rd and 4th chapter, we talk a lot about Cialdini. But the interesting thing is that he says also what has to happen is we have to be aware of the norm. We might just go and our focus might be on something different, right? We don't really care when we go through the world and say like, I wonder what the littering norm here is. But let's say you see somebody litter, okay? So here it's just like you can have like a low salience norm, and here's like the Confederate basically just walks by. Let's say you're in this dirty, and here's just somebody walking by, and then I observe how likely you are to litter. But let's say there's somebody who drops a piece of litter. Now you see, I see, the norm becomes salient, it's fine to kind of litter in this environment here. So it's fine to litter in this environment. Okay, I'm more likely to litter. So if you become aware of norms, so then the influence of norms is much more likely on our behavior. So here the majority, by kind of reminding you that we do litter in our part of the town, that has a bigger influence on you. There's also here in this experiments, they don't find it, but often norms also become apparent and accessible or salient, whatever term you prefer, when somebody kind of goes against the existing norm. Think about somebody who's cutting the line. Now everybody is suddenly thinking about, oh, she cut the line, and we act on that and remind her forcefully that this is not what we are doing in this part of the town. So norms have to become accessible. There are also kind of cultural variations. So you can see, for instance, here on the top, we have two countries, Norway and India, who are very communal, very less individually, more collectively focused. So people are less likely to dissent. Here you have two countries who are more individual, France and the US, and here's more likely that people are cool with descending, that they're more likely to be comfortable. So here the cultural norm is to be an individual, and part of being an individual is have some opinions that dissent from the majority, and this is much more tolerated than in other countries where the emphasis is more on collectivism, on we are a group and it's important that we act as a group, and their dissent is much less likely. There's also, I think we talked about it when we talked about last week about the influence of I think it was on attractive messengers, and that this was bigger for women. It's also and we then kind of showed like, okay, this influence is more or less explained away if you look at the topic. So if we are more knowledgeable about the topic, let's say you're a minority who's really knowledgeable about climate change, then you might not be easily distracted by what the majority is saying, and you're less likely to conform to that. Similar, if the topics are something that is more akin to what men understand a lot about, men are less likely to conform, but the other way around, if it's something that's more female-centric as a topic, then women are less likely to conform. However, there's a small yet persistent influence of gender on public conformity, so men are less likely to public conform, but there's no difference in private conformity. So I think men seem, as a role, it is easier as a man to kind of stand up and say, look, I'm a strong individual person, hence I dissent. That is more tolerated by the majority, by society still, than if for a woman. So that's important to keep in mind. There's other research on who is more likely to consent. Often these are people that are described as having low self-esteem, you're more likely to be influenced by others. Low intelligence, you're more likely to be influenced by others, and so forth. So there's something about who are the people, right? Who's the majority, who's the minority, that influences the majority influence, that impacts the majority influence. So one other thing before we come to the minority influence, and that kind of brings a nice transition, it's also good if somebody dissents. If there's one other person that goes along that also dissents. And here, as you can see by the difference in colors, it doesn't have to be the same. This is just like if there's a group where one person kind of disagrees. So let's think about the ash example that it's cool. Let's think about it in the ash example, right? So let's say this is the person that disagrees here. And let's say you obviously think it's B, the majority says C, and now this person says A. Okay, so for one reason or another. But this makes it less likely that this dude now confirms this one. He's like, okay, this person is like obviously crazy. He thinks A is right, but it seems like descending is fine. Nothing bad happened to him, so I'll descend too. So this changes conformity from 37 to 5. The major influence is obviously if you have a competent other. If the other is also saying B in this case, so if the other person that dissents is basically on your side or very competent, kind of getting the things right, then it's like this has the biggest influence. But even the incompetent, like in the example I explained to you, even an incompetent dissenter is really influenced. So having some people in our group that, even if they're slightly crazy, if they kind of stick out, they have a very strange, different opinion, it's really important for us to be reminded that, hey, you know what, we tolerate different opinions. And so if you feel like, I don't know, I disagree with that, then you feel more empowered to do so. So I think it's good to be reminded that even somewhat crazy outliers, like somebody, for instance, believing in a flat earth, they have their value to us as society. Now let's talk a little bit about kind of minority influence. One thing is like, okay, why is it that basically if I have a different opinion from everybody else, why is it that I conform? One is like because the majority now will dislike you. They don't like you very much. They perceive you often, if you do it not out of self-interest, but when self-interest is absent, they often perceive you as an honest and competent person, yet they dislike you. They would say like, okay, there's something, she's not on our team, she's not with us, we don't like you. Hence, there's a strong dislike for that. But you can see that over time, while not always and not often successful, minorities are successful in changing our minds and opinions about things, okay? So for instance, here you can see, imagine that if we are in the 1960s or 70s or maybe even 80s, I think 80s and 90s is still true, and we have kind of trying to figure out what the majority thinks of the LGBT plus community. And you can see here that at that time, the majority thought, oh, this is not acceptable, this is something unnatural, and so forth. But then over time, this completely changed, and I think for most of us, this is completely uncontroversial. So now the majority thinks perfectly cool or fine. So how can a minority kind of exert its influence on the majority? How can a few convince the many that they are right and that the few are right and the many are wrong? So here's some really interesting take by Moscovici on the Ash example. He says, well, actually, this is not an experiment about majority influence. This is an experiment about minority influence. Here's a crazy minority who influences the majority because he basically think he stands for a large majority who see reality as it is. Everyone else sees that B is correct. This is the large majority that he is basically representing. And then there are these two crazy outliers who are the minority who think, okay, C is correct. And once in a while, the majority, the truth seers, are convinced by the non-truth seers. I think it's a somewhat controversial yet interesting take on this experiment, and says like, okay, it really depends on how we construct the social situation here. And you can, I think you would agree, hopefully, with me, but you don't have to, no need to conform, that this is at least a thought-provoking and interesting take on it. So he, Moscovici and colleagues did a really cool study, a paradigm that they then varied over and over again, but which offers a lot of interesting ways of influencing it. He wants to know how can basically, in his theory of minority influence, Moscovici outlines basically what minorities have to do in order to have a chance to convince the majority. So in his experiment, he would show participant blue squares without the green square. And the green square is just a reminder that there would be a minority, that the minority would say green. So it's like an Ash paradigm where it's like, okay, you see what's the color of the square? Everybody in the room says blue and one person says green, okay? And we want to know when basically people are convinced that they are seeing something blue rather than green. And here in this first experiment, you can see this is the percentage of green responses. Please be aware that this is 9%, okay? So this is not massive. But what you can see basically is that the biggest influence has a consistent minority. So in this experiment, what they would do, there was one group who would always say green, 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 green. And there was another group who would say once in a while green, I think in 2/3 of the cases, and 1/3 they would say blue, an inconsistent minority. And what you can see is that even the influence is not that big, yet there's something clearly, right? There's a chance, there's like one person who sees the world slightly different, consistently convinced in 9% of the cases, the participants, that this is green. So I think it's a quite tremendous influence that they have, right? And so here he kind of Moscovici in his theory says, like, you have to disagree with behavioral style. You have to basically, if you're a minority, what you have to do is you have to be unwavering and consistent. You have to say something. There should be no self-interest. It should be almost run against your self-interest. You should say, this is it. This is how I see the future. This is something that I will not change, that I'm 100% confident. I basically see the world as it is, and you guys are wrong, right? And if you do that consistently, then basically you can convince the majority that there is something out there that you don't see, and you will exert influence. But the basic takeaway from Moscovici's theory is that yes, you have to, in order to be basically influential as a minority, you have to bang the same point over and over and over again. And if you do that with certainty and consistency, you have a chance to convince the majority that there's something out there. There's something that is interesting. We should pay attention to it. So thereby you make the majority uncertain. It's even better than in cases where these become a little bit more blurry. Imagine that it now becomes something more of a teal. Now the majority is much more likely to agree with you. They're kind of ready to agree with you. So this is basically the biggest takeaway is that you have to basically have a confrontational, consistent behavioral style, a rigid style where you say, like, look, this is the reality. You are wrong. I'm right. And you should be uncertain. There's no doubt in my mind that I'm right and you're wrong, and I will not change about it. This creates the uncertainty that enables change. There's one, I think, last bit on minority influence in this chapter is that you can kind of reconnect it to the Cacioppo and Petty elaboration likelihood model that we discussed last week on persuasion. So here it's a persuasive message that's coming in, and it can be either processed by kind of like a central route and a peripheral route. And the central route is basically meaning a high processing, and the peripheral route is a low processing, which here leads to one type of change, and this leads to a more temporary type of change. And similar, a lot of people think about minority influence and dissent in a similar way. You can see there's the normative influence, right? Here in this model, there's often like simple cues tell us what we should do. Normative influence is like that too. There's a simple cue. What is everyone else is doing? I don't really process anything of the message or what is computed in the message, and I just basically publicly conform. This is a somewhat temporal change. I just change my mind publicly, and this is kind of akin to the peripheral role of processing. But there's also the information influence, and that's the one that the minority wants to kind of activate by being rigid about, by being behaviorally rigid, by being confident and consistent. Here now, the majority might start to think, there might be something. I think I should kind of look deeper into that. So there's a central route activator, is deep processing, and this leads to private conformity, which then leads to longer changes in the way we see the world. So it is basically what the minority has to do is to activate in a certain style a kind of uncertainty about the world and the reality out there, and thereby it can influence then people to start thinking about and more deeply processing the message and then change their mind.